And then this difference about like 30 cell counts kind of persisted over time, like about this like 30 cell counts differences over time persisted throughout the 3 years of follow-up. There was some like fluctuations in the slopes over time, but this overall trend of declining kind of remained. But these differences, just remember that there was still these differences over time. So this lower right panel was the other analysis they conducted to look at time to 50% decline from baseline in CD4 counts. And that's where they found statistically significant difference with p-value 0.004. So there was a significant difference kind of in the immediate group. It was time to decline 50% of the CD4 counts was much longer than the deferred group. And they also reported the prophylaxis use against pneumonia, because that's something they modified halfway through the trial. And they've shown that in people with immediate initiation group, overall, the time to start PCP prophylaxis happen later than in the deferred group. Because kind of one of the major indicator for starting the prophylaxis is those low CD4 counts. So with the active drug starting in immediate group and to slow down their CD4 count decline, and it makes sense that they will in general started the prophylaxis treatment later. And you can see from this table that more people started the prophylaxis in the deferred group. So 278 in immediate group versus 335. So here is the adverse event summaries where they listed some key categories. They didn't print out all those event details, but we can see that the majority were from, so the total number of patients experiencing this AEs, so 99 in the immediate group versus 38. And the majority were related to like GI, also this is the number of people stopping the treatment due to AE, so 99 versus 38. And majority of them were due to GI events or like neurological malaise events, and a few of them were related to hematological events.
For those of you who are familiar with HIV drugs in general, they're very difficult to tolerate, especially those first generation ones. And in addition to that, that is one of the reasoning for why this trial was needed, why the patient population also wanted it, to see if a delay in the actual treatment could be potentially beneficial with regards to some of these toxicities.
Yeah, and overall this event rate is low, so it's relatively safe. All right, so we've gone through the major results, and moving on to the discussion section. So the first question is, how did the amendment in October 1989 influence the results and interpretation of this trial? We kind of touched on a little bit earlier when we talk about the study terminations. Any thoughts?
Go ahead, Dr. Jobs.
Yeah, so the other thing about this trial that was so important at the time was the effect of zidovudine wore off after a year. So people would get about a year of added survival, and then due to viral resistance, the effect would be lost. And so the reason for the trial was, do you want to start it early? Does that have more benefit? Or do you want to wait until you really need it, recognizing that you'll get the benefit later? And it's a trial that now, with the treatments that we have that are highly effective, is not an important consideration, and much better tolerated. And as you pointed out, zidovudine was not easy to take, and so the other question was, how well would the people do in terms of the adverse events starting it early? And so this was actually a pretty important trial at the time. Not so important now that we have better treatments, but at the time, everybody wanted to know what to do. And I remember at the time that the decisions were made clinically to defer therapy until they were symptomatic or had low CD4 counts.
Yeah, that was very important kind of background information to understand the context of the study and the importance of the results. So the study was originally planned to test the immediate treatment policy versus deferred treatment policy. However, they had to modify the study design to allow open zidovudine use midway through the study. What do you think, how that will influence or affect the interpretation of the comparison of the two treatment policies, immediate versus deferred initiation?
Come in the chat.
This is a randomized trial that will be better because both arm will be taking, assume both arm will be taking the drug in a similar pattern. Because looks like it's a pretty well balanced comparison. So hopefully that won't have too much of an influence.
Right.
It's a drug trial, but it's not a drug trial, right? We're studying two different protocols, which makes it a little trickier, I think, in this case.
If it's a single arm trial, then
Mhm. Absolutely.
And I saw that they did an analysis stratifying by calendar time, so pre and post October 1989, and it seems like the results were robust, so not a lot of difference.
Yeah. Right, so if for sure kind of deviated from the original plan to like test the immediate versus deferred group. So with this like change of treatment dynamics to allow open zidovudine use, it's likely to have the increased use of zidovudine in the deferred group before the onset of clinical symptoms, which was the original plan. And also wanted to point out that this open zidovudine use was judged by clinicians. So there are some differences in their decision making. Some were more based on the symptoms, some probably rely more on the CD4 count level. So there were differences by clinicians' behavior. And the data interpretation challenges, like this open use may blur the distinction between the intended distinct treatment policy of immediate versus deferred therapy. But we need to acknowledge that this make it more flexible and the results is more clinically relevant because it kept up with the clinical guidance and conducted in a more pragmatic way. So in the discussion session, they also show some of the relevant trials. For example, this VA2-19-8 study conducted in the early symptomatic infection population, which was also comparing the immediate versus deferred treatment policies, similar to our Concord study. And all the others, the rest of the 6 other trials were comparing zidovudine versus placebo. So that's one difference. This VA2-19 was comparing 2 different treatment policy. However, if we look at some of the design details, this one, they restricted to people with CD4 counts at entry ranging from 200 to 500. And sample size was a little bit smaller, yeah, I forgot like what their results, but looks like it's not that different between the groups from the 2 treatment policies, but that was in the symptomatic population, which is slightly different from ours. And all the others, and these 2, these ACTG 16 and 19 were the 2 trials that published during this Concord trial that triggered the protocol amendment. However, even though they have the statistically significant results and leading to their early termination, if you look at their overall survival or progression to AIDS or death, you can see like they have overall very small event counts, event rates, and the follow-up time was very short. The average follow-up was about 11 months, 13 months, versus in our study was over like 3 years in this Concord study. So that's an important factor to consider when you look at the results, long-term or short-term, and how you interpret the study by comparing their population and the follow-up time. So I think this summary of the similar or relevant trials in the discussion session was really helpful.
Hands on.
Yeah, Dr. Jeffs, go ahead, please.
So I think that the Concord allowed you to initiate zidovudine when the CD4 count fell below 500. So any of the studies that start with lower CD4 counts really are not relevant to the Concord, or not directly comparable, because in Concord, they would have all been started on zidovudine. It's really the only comparable ones are the ones that allow people to have CD4 counts over 400. So most of these, except for ACTG 16, are not strictly comparable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the rules to starting open zidovudine, even though they only mention less than 500, but the decision was still left to clinicians, some may start it really low when you like get to as low as 200, but some start it about 400. So there are still some variations there. Yeah. So last question. What are the clinical implications of this study? Kind of looking at their overall conclusion.
I guess my biggest takeaway was that they say they call into question the uncritical use of CD4 counts as a surrogate endpoint. So it's not necessarily meaning that there's going to be increased survival or longer time to death. And I thought that was really interesting insight because in my head, it's not a HIV researcher. I had assumed that they were. Was proper.
That's a really good point, Liz. I think if you're a patient and, looking at the results from figure 4, which shows, some differences in CD4 count, you might want to hop on to this drug a lot sooner. But then looking at the results from figure 3, you see it doesn't pan out that way. And I was curious about that too. I'm not, I don't do drug approvals in HIV, but it seems like the surrogate endpoint that's used is mostly HIV RNA. So the drugs that have been approved usually go for that as a surrogate marker.
Mhm. Anyone online? Want to chime in? Yes, Dr. Jeffs.
The trick is that at that time we had only zidovudine. And the results really said that if you have somebody with asymptomatic HIV infection, there's not a substantial benefit in terms of starting HIV then, as opposed to waiting until they become symptomatic or their CD4 count falls below 500. And so that became a viable strategy. And it's a viable strategy because I mentioned earlier, you only got a year out of zidovudine before its effect was lost. We saw that in the CD4 count. They would go up and then they fell right in parallel to what they were falling in the deferred group. And so if you were asymptomatic, you were going to get side effects from the drug and no long-term benefit. And so the decision really became, why not wait and defer starting until they become symptomatic with ARC or CD4 less than 500, and then you'll get the same benefit on progression to AIDS and on progression to or death. So it helped dictate a strategy that don't give people a toxic drug with side effects during the period when they're asymptomatic, start it once they become symptomatic. Again, this is of historical significance because today, the minute you get an HIV diagnosis, you get started on treatment because we have well-tolerated drugs with sustained effectiveness, driving levels to HIV levels in the blood to undetectable and clearly improving lifespan and time to progression and a variety of other things. But at the time, it was important for how we decided to use the drug.
Yeah, and I just want to add it to that in the paper, they mentioned that they didn't do a cost-effective analysis, but that was something that they were planning to do. But it would be important, like, to look at from cost-effective perspective. There may be a major difference to starting early versus late.
So the other thing you might have done was some sort of quality of life measurement and see, you could have looked into see if their quality of life was better different in the two groups, particularly due to the decreased side effects in the deferred group early on until they start treatment, your tool may or may not have been sensitive enough to pick up a difference, but that would have been another outcome they could have looked at, as well as cost effectiveness.
Yeah, I think they mentioned somewhere in the paper that they also collected some measures of quality of life, and then and also like adverse event details that they were planning to publish in the subsequent papers. Yeah.
I would just like to say that from what I remember, in 1989, when this study was done, they didn't have the viral load yet. So I have a somewhat, unfortunately, a personal knowledge of HIV. So at the time, if you could be having 400 T cells and have 500,000 viral load and you were really sick, or you could be having 250 T cells and a relatively low viral load because they didn't know back then. So I feel like the clinical decisions that they made in this trial are really historical. It's really interesting to see how they how we come along with this. But yeah, those were the days. Yeah, and I agree with the person that said before. I'm sorry, I'm actually connecting from the phone today. That there were decisions to be made in terms of when to start the treatment, because that's all they had back then. So kudos to them. It was an amazing trial for setting the ground for later.
Yeah. Right, so this wasn't important even though they had to modify and deviate from the original plan, but this was a very important pragmatic trial showing that there was no still significant difference or clinical important benefit over survival disease progression between immediate versus deferred use of zidovudine over a long-term follow-up of 3 years. However, the study also kind of shown some intrinsic and clinical benefits in delaying the progression to AIDS-related complex, AIDS or death as an outcome comparing these two treatment policy, primarily due to a delay in the progression to AIDS-related complex. But also noted that this benefit was not sustained over long term, and suggesting that early advantage doesn't translate into long-lasting clinical improvement. Right, and we discussed earlier about the CD4 count findings. The small but highly significant persistent difference in CD4 counts between the groups was not translated into significant clinical benefits. And the adverse events were higher in the immediate group, but overall low absolute frequency. And so to conclude, the results do not support early use of zidovudine as a monotherapy, which is important in the asymptomatic HIV infected results. And the optimal timing to start remain unclear from this study.
At that time,
Yeah, at that time.
it's come a long way since.
Yeah, just imagine we were 30 years ago looking at the results.
I'll send a 60 Minutes clip. It's like a 10-minute clip from 60 Minutes from 1997 that kind of talks about the shift from the single to multi-drug therapy. It really gives a vibe of the time. So I'll send that now in a follow-up email.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be awesome to watch. Yeah.
Any other final comments? Online? Okay. Thank you, everyone. We have our seminar coming up on October 3rd. So we'll see you then.
That's the 8:30 seminar.
Yep.
We won't be there.
Nice.
All right, thank you. Bye.